Hey everybody, happy Friday and welcome to Science Friday number 9. I'm really excited about the topic this week for a couple reasons. The first being that it's something that I know a little bit about. And the second is that it was requested from a viewer. In fact, a viewer who happens to be a very old friend of mine from way back in my high school days, a lady named Shannon Von Wolf, who watches these things and reads Howlin at the Moon. And she DM'd me last week and asked if I would talk about the moon landings and the various conspiracy theories, the allegation of hoaxes and things like that that are associated with it. And I told her I'd be delighted to do it. And again, I'm delighted for a couple of reasons. First of all, because Shannon asked, and I think that's awesome. But the second thing is I've actually worked for NASA a couple of times under different contracts, and I have some direct experience working with lunar samples. So it is something I'd like to talk to you about this week. Now, good news, bad news. The good news is if you are like most people and you understand that clearly the United States sent astronauts to the moon several times between 1969 and 1974-75, then you're going to be in good shape because I'm going to tell you things that are going to make complete sense to you. If you are, however, one of these folks, and I have to admit, there are some people in my family growing up that thought that the moon landings had been fake, that thought that they were filmed in Hollywood and on a back lot somewhere in a warehouse. That isn't true. There's plenty of evidence that we did actually land on the moon. It's another one of those kind of things where I think Occam's razor comes into play. In order for us to have faked the moon landings, we would have to have figured out a way to gin up the most gigantic conspiracy ever. Now, I submit it would involve, nearly 400,000 people would be involved in this. All the astronauts, all the people that worked at NASA, all the scientists, people like me who analyze lunar samples. We would all have to be in on it. And Occam's razor just says that's very unlikely. The alternative, which is that we really did go to the moon, would be way easier than faking it. Look, Nixon, about the same time, really wanted to cover up Watergate. Couldn't do it, right? These conspiracy things get out after a while. If someone really is trying to cover something like this up, if there's more than just a few people involved, it generally doesn't take very long to get out. So just on the face of it, it's absurd to believe that we faked all these moon landings. It would have taken more energy to fake it than it did to go there. It was a marvelous technical achievement. I remember, being 13 years old and watching the moon landings on TV that July in a friend of mine's house. It was just the most awesome thing in the world. You'd walk downtown and, all of the appliance shops had TVs sitting in the window, and there'd be people standing outside the windows watching Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walk around the moon. It was just the most awesome thing ever. So what I want to do this week is just talk about some of the major conspiracy theories, some of the things that people say, aha, this proves we couldn't have been there, and debunk them a little bit. Now, I don't have time to spend a lot of time doing this. If you just type in moon landing hoaxes or moon landing conspiracy theories in your internet browser, you'll come up the first few sites that could do a really good job of debunking all of these theories, and I'll just refer you to one of those for more details on any of this. But I just want to cover like the major 5 or 6 things that people talk about and show why it's fairly easy to show that these aren't true. Now, as I mentioned before, I myself have handled lunar samples. I've worked for NASA a couple of times, and I've been to the Space Flight Center. I've talked to scientists. I know people that were involved in the moon landings. I've met astronauts. It happened, and the evidence is overwhelming that it happens. When you look at the lunar samples and you analyze what they're made of, the rocks that we brought back, it's pretty clear that those rocks, although they are related to Earth, they were formed on the moon. Now, let's talk about the evidence that the conspiracy theorists like to put out there. The first is that the photos are all wrong. And there's all kinds of things wrong with these photos, allegedly, that were taken on the moon. The first thing is that the shadows don't have parallel lines in them. And that's a big thing. Look at these shadows. They don't have parallel lines, and sometimes you see 2 shadows, and they come up with all this stuff. Well, the bad news is you see exactly the same thing on Earth. There aren't always parallel lines associated with shadows. And in some cases, you can cast more than one shadow. The only thing, a shadow isn't always created by just the sun. It can be light that's being reflected off of other things. And on the surface of the moon, there's 2 pretty big sources for light. One is the sun, and the other's the light that's being reflected off the Earth. So it's not at all beyond the pale that you would see two shadows, one strong, one a lot fainter, perhaps. So there's nothing wrong with that. Another thing people look at is they look at like these photos and they go, look, the crosshairs in the photo, and in some cases they're not lined up right. In other cases the crosshairs appear actually behind objects. They're blotted out by objects and stuff. Those are all artifacts of the way the photographs were developed. This was before the digital age, right? And you actually had to develop these photographs. They were shot on film, and you had to develop them in a tank with chemicals. I spent many nights in my college career doing exactly the same thing because I took photography classes and I developed all my own stuff. So a lot of those things are just artifacts of the developing process, or what happens when you reproduce a print, when you photocopy a print or reproduce it in some way for publication. They talk about the quality of the photographs was either too good or not good enough. I mean, there's all kinds of things about these photos, and anybody that knows anything about photography or light can easily debunk all of this stuff that has to do with photos. My favorite one is like things in the background that are they don't look the right distance away. Well, the moon doesn't have an atmosphere, so on Earth, one of the reasons things sometimes appear either farther away or closer, depending upon the meteorological conditions, is because of the atmosphere. The moon doesn't have an atmosphere, so there's no mirage effect of the moon. Things don't appear closer due to, for instance, things like superior mirages, and they don't appear farther away because of the scattering of light as it moves through the air. Now, the second thing that people like to come up with is there's no way that the astronauts could have survived the dose of radiation they would have gotten traveling through space from the Earth to the moon. And they talk about the Earth's Van Allen radiation belts. Now, there's two Van Allen belts that you have to worry about, an inner and an outer, and then there's a third one that's kind of transitory. That's not that much of a problem. The inner one's the one where you really have to worry. There's some pretty energetic protons that you go through. The outer one, not as much of a worry, but timing is everything. And the transit through the inner Van Allen belt, which is the one that you have to worry about, took a matter of minutes. You just didn't spend enough time there. You're surrounded by a space capsule, which provides you with some protection from the radiation. You just don't get a very big dose going through it. And in the outer one, you spend, less than 90 minutes going through it. So there's just not that much of a hazard there. Now, another big thing that people like to point out is there's no stars in any of these photos. Well, here's the deal. Every single photograph taken on the surface of the moon was taken during broad daylight. We spent all of our time on the moon in daylight. And the interesting thing about that is you don't see stars in the sky on Earth during daytime either. Now, a lot of you would say, those of you who watch these things would say, well, wait a minute. The atmosphere scatters all that blue light and it obliterates the stars. Even if we didn't have an atmosphere, when the sun's up, it's so much brighter than those stars that unless you figured out a way to blot out the sun and take long exposure photographs, you wouldn't see any stars above the Earth either. It's just that the sun is so much brighter than the stars that it washes them out in photographs. You have to actually spend a lot of time making sure that you can isolate the sun from everything else that you want to photograph if you're going to take photographs of the stars from the surface of the moon. The flag, that's another big one. Look, the flag looks like it's waving in the wind and there's no wind on the surface of the moon. That's true, but the reason that flag appeared to be waving is that, A, it was supported by a rod that ran along the top. You can see that if you look closely enough in some of the photographs. The second thing is it'd been rolled up. It'd been rolled up and stuffed, I believe, in a tube. So when they took it out, it was wrinkled. So they took it out, they insert the rod in the top of it, they hang the thing on the flagpole, it just kind of looks wrinkly. But it doesn't move. If you look at various photos that are shot as they walk around, the flag is not waving in the wind. It looks the same way every time you look at it. Another one, this is my favorite. Well, okay, who is it that filmed Neil Armstrong coming down the ladder from the lunar module? Nobody filmed him. They had a camera that they'd already deployed onto the surface of the moon. They fired it up. It was relaying photographs back to Earth before they even opened the door to the lunar module to descend the ladder, the landing stage anyway. Another thing is that the surface of the moon is baked. You know, the side of the moon that sees the sun all the time gets so hot that, we would have fried astronauts that walk there. That's not true. The moon doesn't have an atmosphere. So, yeah, there's some pretty intense solar radiation on the surface of the moon, but it's also white. The regolith, the layer of rock shards and dust that covers the surface of the moon, is pretty highly reflective, so it reflects a lot of that light right back into space. And without an atmosphere to contain it, the surface of the moon doesn't get very hot. It's not hot at all, in fact. Another thing, the footprints on the moon are really perfect, and they're a lot more perfect than you would see on a beach, for instance, on ocean Earth. That's because on Earth, things get weathered by water and wind and other kinds of erosion, so the grains tend to be kind of rounded. On the moon, that doesn't happen. There's no wind on the moon. There's no water on the moon. So you get these little rock shards in the regolith, that dusted rock that covers the surface of the moon, and they're kind of sharp. So when you step in them, it leaves a really, the grains kind of like to stick together, and they form really sharp indentations. And then finally, you don't see rocket blasts. You have this rocket descending from orbit around the moon, and it touches down the moon, and you don't see a big crater, a big blast crater from the rocket. Well, you wouldn't expect to, for two reasons. The first reason is that rarely were the lunar modules descending straight down. They were usually coming in kind of down and at an angle. The second thing is the gravity of the moon is a lot less than the gravity in the Earth. And you don't have to you've done most of your slowing down before you get very close to the surface of the moon. So the pressure from the nozzles was very, very, very low. It's not a huge blast that you see at all just before you touch down. But even at that, you can see some fine dust being scattered. It's not a lot, but you can see it if you look carefully enough. So there you go. Those are the major things that people talk about. Again, I could spend 90 minutes debunking these theories, and it wouldn't do a bit of good for the people that are going to believe what they're going to believe. But hopefully, more than anything else, I hope this piques your interest and you follow through on some of this stuff. So Shannon, thank you very much for putting me onto the topic. And for the rest of you, I'll be seeing you. Cheers.